color coordinated every day. I walk out of the house, you know, she got to
That's right.
make
In
sure.
her spare time,
Huh?
in her spare time, she makes them.
Oh, she takes care of me. And then she, boy, she does look so colorful.
I had a professor in college that was our choir director. And he came in one day very not coordinated. And actually it was pretty coordinated, it was just really loud. And loud, like bright purple shirt, and of course this is back in the 70s, so you know, the big wide tie with the psychedelic flowers all over it, and then this yellow, kind of yellow sport coat, and we're all just like, oh my gosh. And he said, my wife wasn't home when I left this morning. So there you go. Okay, I have a confession to make about this lesson. How many of you actually read your Sunday school lesson before you got here today? Yay, 2 of you, all right. I mean, it's some really good stuff, but it's like, as I was reading through it, it's like, this is kind of the same thing that we talked about last week. It's different specifics, but it's kind of the same thing that we talked about last week. So I had a little trouble kind of wading through it and trying to figure out exactly what to do with it.
Except this week it talks more about living by your convictions and not judging others, but about living
Yeah,
with theirs.
yeah, and that's very true. So that's kind of where we're gonna go with this. Everybody feel free to chime in, not just Casey.
Do
Although,
I?
I said everybody can chime in,
Oh,
not just Casey, so,
but remember, I'm right.
okay, and also remember that we're on video, so. Yeah, I saw Garland this week outside, he drove by and he said, he asked me if we had the service, if we recorded the service, and I said, yeah, I said, but we didn't do Sunday school, and he said, I really would like to see Sunday school too, so that's what we're doing here.
All right.
Okay, so all of us are kind of in a spot in our lives where we kind of pay attention to our physical body a little more than maybe we did 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, because things just aren't working quite as well. Okay, I'm getting a funny look from David. Yours is working great, right?
Or you just now figuring that out?
Well, keep in mind I'm younger than you are, so
A lot younger.
he said that, I didn't.
Thank you, Casey.
But yeah, you know, it's, you get down on the floor to do something and you know, pick up something or fix something, and it's like, okay, what else can I do while I'm down here? Because of all the creaking and crunching that happens when you get up, and the things that you used to not think about, you just automatically did them, and now it's like, I shouldn't have done that way. I'm gonna pay for this tomorrow, or all of those things that start to.
I think what I've noticed is further to the floor than it used to be.
Amen.
There you go. Yeah. So as one thing in your body kind of doesn't work as well as it used to, or you start having a problem with something, what do you know, how else does that affect the rest of you?
In everything you do, everything else is affected.
Amen.
It's a domino.
Yeah, this is a really minor thing, but I have a little cut on my finger right here. It probably came from a guitar string last week. I'm not really sure where it came from, but it's like it's like teeny tiny, but yet it reminds me that it's there every time I touch something. And I got a little piece of paper caught in it yesterday and thought I was gonna go through the roof. you know, Jerry, with your cancer, you know, that affected everything about you, I'm sure. What, was there something that you were surprised at that it affected? Like just during your treatment and stuff? Maybe
It's just affected everything. And people don't think there is a chemo brain, but there is such a thing as chemo brain, and I've got it.
I have heard a lot of people say that, and I'm guessing that that may be one thing that you don't expect.
And this week, it will be a year I finished.
Yay!
Praise God.
It started radiation.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. You know, you stub your toe and you realize how valuable that little tiny thing on the end of your foot is. In fact, I think it hurts worse when you stub the little one than it does when you stub the big one. Yeah.
Hurts all the way up to your knee.
It does, it does.
But that's good, you have feelings.
Exactly.
We can still feel.
That's right.
Okay, okay.
Everybody look at that.
So let's transition from that to the church, the body of believers. And you can think broad term in, you know, like the church, or you can think us specifically. How does one person not working like it's supposed to, whether that's through illness or something else, how does that affect the rest of us?
Well, if everybody's using their God-given gift, and that's, you know, several people could have the same gift, but if one of those persons got ill or passed away or something, everybody in that group would miss that gift. And that's the way the church is. If somebody in the church is not using their gift, then everybody else is gonna suffer.
That's good. Okay, so yeah, so let's chase a small rabbit here that's not in this lesson. How many of you know what your spiritual gift is?
I kinda think mine's to love others.
Okay. Okay, do we know what the spiritual gifts are? What are they, or at least give us a list.
I can't name them all.
That's okay.
I know that.
Give it your best shot.
Let's go, David, let's hear it.
It's giving, not her. I can't think of the words, where you preach, what do they call that?
Well, are you thinking about prophecy?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and then there's another one right along that same line. It's where you kind of admonish, is that it?
Encouragers.
Well,
Some people have the gift of encouragement, which is called,
giving,
my mind's blank.
caring, is it caring? I can't. remember.
Hospitality.
I know where
Okay.
they are in the Bible, but.
Evangelist.
Okay.
That's
Yeah,
I'm
there's,
called an
okay.
evangelist.
I'm just gonna kind of run through some that are popping into my head as you're talking, and we may veer off at some point and do
It's good.
a study on the gifts, because that's an important thing.
Yeah.
There's preaching and teaching and evangelist and service/helps, hospitality, giving. Depending on who you talk to and what study you look at, there's anything from 8 or 9 to, I've seen as many as 15 or 20, and it's that's kind of stretching and subdividing and that kind of thing. And interestingly enough, I have a friend that did a study one time and included a bunch of stuff from the Old Testament as well, which was really interesting. And let me just continue the rabbit here for a second. A gift and a talent are not the same thing,
Right.
okay? I know lots of people who can play circles around me on the piano, but they don't have a gift to be able to use that in a ministry position. God just did, and they're strong believers, God just did not gift them that way. And so that's a whole nother, you know, they may be a great teacher in the classroom, you know, they love teaching history to high school students, but they don't have the gift of teaching within the church. And so that's a whole nother, that's not even a rabbit, that's probably a kangaroo or an antelope or something. But anyway, but what David said is very true. If one of us either is not using our gift or something happens to where we can't, the body suffers. You know, your hand hurts, your body suffers. You have a headache, your body suffers. So all of those things happen or have correlation within the church body as well. And even though this is not the section that Paul talks about the spiritual gifts, he's kind of touching on them just a little bit. So let's, somebody, before we jump into this, and it's going to sound like I'm totally changing gears and I'm really not, somebody read Matthew 7, 1 through 5.
Yes. Get there a second. Matthew who?
7, 1 through 5. And by the way, if you do not have a Bible with you and you need one, there are some over there on the bookshelf, and we wiped them off last week.
Judge not that ye be not judged, for with what judgment ye judge ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye met, it shall be measured unto you. And while beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold the beam is in thy own eye? The hypocrite first cast out the beam of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before the swine, lest they trample them under their feet, and turn again, and rend you. Ask, and it shall be given. Ye seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you.
Okay. So the gist of that first little section is we're not supposed to be judging other people. And we can go off on just that little tiny phrase and debate both sides of it, because there's other places that Scripture kind of tells us to do that. And so we just kind of have to balance that out there. But we're going to look more at the attitude behind that, the judgmental attitude. And Paul specifically was talking in this passage about things that don't really matter that much. There's a phrase that kind of gets popular off and on, says, is that a hill to die on? And there are some things that are that important. Paul is talking about here about our attitude toward things that aren't that important. And so let's look at Romans 14. And I'm just going to read part of this here, starting in verse 1. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and not let the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. So Paul is addressing a pretty big issue between Jews and Gentiles, where, and if you remember back in the Old Testament, especially in the period of the Exodus, when all the laws were given, there was some pretty strict standards on what they could eat and what they couldn't eat. And there's a lot of spiritual reasons for those things, but there's also a lot of physical reasons for those things. We know they didn't have refrigeration back then. There was no way to, other than smoking, I guess that would be what you would call it, smoking their meats, in order to preserve them. But they didn't, there was no refrigeration. So for the most part, they had to kind of eat what they had right then and not save it for a long period of time. And so that was the reason for not eating certain things. And the things that certain animals ate made them toxic, if you will. I don't know a whole lot about feeding farm animals. You guys know a whole lot more about that than I do. But I have heard, well, and God was very specific about the hooves of the animals that you could eat and the ones that you couldn't eat. The pigs, the swine, were unclean. I don't really know why. I'm sure some of you guys do. But cattle, the solid hoof animals, were fine to eat. And it became not only a physical issue, but a spiritual issue. And then, as always happens with humans, things started to get sticky and legalistic. And this is kind of where Paul is coming from on this, what he's addressing. Those on the one side didn't want to eat anything that was unclean. Meat, fruits, vegetables, whatever. The ones on the other side, the Gentiles who didn't have those laws, didn't care what they ate. And as the Gentiles got saved, they came into the church, but we're still talking Jewish church, even though they were Christians at this point. We're talking Jewish church, Jewish tradition, Jewish laws and regulations. And by golly, that Gentile just walked in the door chewing on a pig's foot. And that's just, we're just not going to have that. And that is the area that Paul is really addressing here. And so, and he's trying to get them to see that that may not be all that important. The real question is their relationship with God. And then, and he kind of wanders through this a little bit, and it gets a little tedious to me, at least it did this week as I was trying to read it, and trying to figure out what to do with it, and reading through the stuff that the Sunday school material has about it. But there was one thing that really jumped out at me in this first section. Let me go ahead and read verses 5 through 10, and then I'll jump in here. In verse 5, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living. why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. And then we'll all stop right there. So he's talking about eating or not eating. He's talking about celebrating the holy days or not celebrating them. And he's talking about servants and their masters. And a lot of, just like us, we look at someone who works for someone else that we really don't have anything to do with, and yet wonder why they do what they do. Why doesn't their boss fill in the blank? Here's the bottom line with that. A believer who judged another believer is usurping God's authority as the only righteous judge. Can we all say ouch?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I've got that highlighted in yellow and underlined. We are so quick to throw our opinion out and look at what somebody's doing or not doing, saying or not saying, their lifestyle, whatever it is. And because it's not like mine, it's wrong.
Amen.
Or is it? There are certain things that, yes, God is very specific about in Scripture that I don't think it's called judging to say someone who, is an alcoholic or a drug addict or, is a prostitute or someone who abuses a family member, however that manifests itself. I don't know that that's judging that person to say that that's wrong to do that. But just because Casey eats chili dogs and I can't stand hot dogs of any form, is that something that's gonna mess our friendship? Shoot, he does the same thing. Am I gonna let that mess up my marriage because he likes hot dogs and I don't? Now, I will tell you he has to fix his own. But that's not something to leave a marriage for, to break up a friendship over, because somebody likes hot dogs and I don't. Now, if Bob was doing something totally, completely against everything that God says to do, that's another story. And he's not, by the way, okay? We're good. Just wanted to clarify that since this is on video. But, there's things that are important and there's things that are not important. And that's really what Paul is looking at here. And then he jumps over into the other areas, the holy days, how a master and a slave interact with each other. So one of the things that I wrote down, I'm kind of going backwards just a little bit here, but there are so many things in our culture today, our lives today, and I had to laugh again because so much of this fits in with this whole virus mess and what's going on with that, with should we open the church or should we not open the church? Should we wear masks or should we not wear masks? Where does my right to not wear one take away your right to have me wear one as a protection? There's so many of those things, and I'm not trying to get into a discussion on what's right or wrong with that, but that's a real biggie right now. But those are things that we just need to look at here. But I think in all areas of our life, but especially in the area of the church, we need to show grace. We need to accept people for who they are, where they are. Every single one of us that walks through this door is in a different place, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. We all deserve the acceptance of this group of people. We all deserve God's grace. And we need to show that as we go through our daily lives.
Where I see a lot of this is in the high school. I work with kids at the schools because I'm a lieutenant governor, and they're getting bullied really bad, especially the Christians. And it's hard for them to meet the expectations of the bullies, and they end up committing suicide. There are several young people that have committed suicide, especially in Ponca City. It is really bad up there because there's lots of churches, and a lot of them I know that do go to church is being bullied really, really bad. You know, and they don't know where they stand, and then they end up taking their life. You know, and the ones that's doing the bullying do not go to church. And it's hard on the Christian.
It is, and that brings up the point even more that we need to stand together as a body of believers. We need to pray for each other. We need to show that grace. I mean, what would we do if the bully walked through the door right now? You know? And those are just things that we all live with every day. And I remember a long time ago, I had a major conflict with my immediate supervisor in the job that I had. And it didn't matter what I did, she was gonna find something wrong with it. Sometimes it was nitpicky, sometimes it was legitimate, but we just clashed all the time. And I was reading scripture and I was praying and just asking God, how do I handle this? How do I handle this? How do I handle this? And the only thing that he kept saying to me was, I love her as much as I love you. Okay, but Lord, I love her as much as I love you. Okay, but God, what? I love her as much as I love you. She doesn't know me. What are you going to do about that? Now, I never did get the opportunity to actually share Jesus with her word for word. But I really had to check myself on my attitudes, on what I said, just about stuff in general. She was my immediate supervisor. I had to report to her. And I was responsible to God for how I handled that. I wasn't responsible for how she handled it. And so I had to remember that a lot. So our goal is to always honor God. Always, always, my first priority has to be, is what I'm gonna do, say, think, act, will that bring honor and glory to the Father? Or is that gonna turn somebody away from Him? And that is the only thing, I mean, that's the bottom line here. Everything must be to honor Him, no matter what the cost. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for the fact that you love all of us in spite of ourselves. I pray that as we go through our week and as that we rub shoulders figuratively with people, that our number one thought would be that you love them as much as you love us. And that we can look at the things that are important to deal with and the things that really don't matter. Help us to show your love in all that we do and say. For it's in your name we pray.